70,000. That's not just some statistic. That is the number of Roman soldiers killed in a single day.
I mean, how does something like that even happen? The Roman historian Livy paints this absolutely horrifying picture for us. He describes men so desperate, so terrified to escape the slaughter, that they literally dug pits with their own hands, buried their heads in the dirt, and just suffocated. So you gotta ask, how could the most powerful army on the planet be so completely, so hopelessly destroyed? Well, that's because this is the story of the Battle of Cannae. And let me tell you, it's a battle that was both the single greatest tactical masterpiece ever conceived and, at the same time, the source of one of history's most successful cover-ups. We're going to unravel both the genius strategy and the incredible lie behind it. So if you're into history that feels more like a thriller, you're going to want to be subscribed for what we've got coming up.
All right, let's get right into it. Part 1, A Genius Crosses the Alps. Our story really kicks off with one man, an absolute legend, Hannibal Barca. He was Rome's greatest enemy, and he decided to do something no one thought was possible, to bring the war right to their doorstep, to the very heart of the Republic.
And believe me, this wasn't his first rodeo. After kicking off the Second Punic War, Hannibal pulls off one of the most insane moves in all of military history. He marches his entire army, we're talking elephants and everything, right over the frozen Alps. And after that, he just starts humiliating Roman armies, one after another. First, a huge victory at the Trebia River, then a devastating ambush at Lake Trasimene. This guy was like a ghost, an absolute genius, and he seemed totally unstoppable.
So, as you can imagine, Rome was terrified. Their first response was actually pretty smart, but it was deeply unpopular. They called it the Fabian strategy. Basically, it was a war of shadows, a war of attrition. The plan was to avoid fighting Hannibal directly, cut off his supplies, and just slowly bleed his army dry. And you know what? It was working. But it just wasn't the Roman way. Romans didn't win by playing hide and seek. They won by meeting their enemies head on and crushing them.
And all that public pressure, all that demand for a glorious victory, it led to a really, really bad decision. Rome elected 2 new consuls who were polar opposites. On one hand, you have Lucius Aemilius Paulus, he's the cautious, experienced aristocrat. On the other, Gaius Terentius Varro, an aggressive new man, kind of like an outsider to the old elite, who basically ran on the promise of smashing Hannibal into the ground. Now here's the kicker, the fatal flaw. They had to share command, switching who was in charge every single day. What could possibly go wrong, right?
So to finally put an end to this Hannibal problem, Rome assembled the biggest army it had ever put into the field. We're talking 86,000 men. Think about that. A force nearly double the size of Hannibal's entire army. This wasn't supposed to be a fair fight. This was supposed to be an execution.
But as it turns out, Hannibal wasn't the one walking into an execution. He was the one building the perfect trap.
See, Hannibal's genius wasn't just about troop movements. It was about how he could weaponize the world itself. First, the terrain. He picks this flat plain right next to the Aphytis River, which boxed the Romans in, limiting their space to move or run. Then, the sun. He positioned his army so that the morning sun would be shining directly into the Romans' eyes. And then, the wind. He knew a southeasterly wind would kick up, and he used it to blow dust and sand right into their faces. He wasn't just fighting with an army. He was fighting with the sun, the wind, and the very ground beneath their feet.
And then there was his formation. Now, to any Roman commander looking at this, it must have looked like a huge mistake. He put his weakest, least reliable soldiers, the Gauls and Iberians, right in the center and had them bulging forward in this curved line. Meanwhile, his best troops, his elite African infantry, were held way back on the flanks. It looked completely backwards. Unless, of course, you realize the whole thing was a trap.
And this is how his masterpiece, the double envelopment, unfolded. It happened in 3 simple, devastating steps. First step, the lure. The massive Roman legion smash into the center, just like Hannibal knew they would. And his weak center does exactly what it was told. It falls back, but it doesn't break. It bends, pulling the Romans deeper and deeper into a U-shape. Step 2, the jaws. Now that the Romans are overextended, their flanks are totally exposed. And that's when Hannibal's elite African infantry, who were waiting on the wings, pivot inwards and just slam into the sides of the Roman line. And finally, step 3, the hammer. While all this was happening, Hannibal's incredible cavalry had already routed their Roman counterparts. Now they circle back around and smash into the rear of the Roman infantry. The trap was shut, there was no escape.
The brilliant tactical part of the battle was over. Now, the slaughter began.
You see, the Romans' greatest strength, their sheer numbers,
had just become their fatal weakness. They were packed together so tightly, jammed in from all four sides, that most of them couldn't even lift their arms to swing a sword. They weren't an army anymore. They were just a terrified, compressed mass of human beings, waiting for the end.
The historian Polybius put it this way, and it's just chilling. He wrote, quote, "While their ranks were continuously eliminated and the survivors were forced to retreat and huddle together, all of them were, in the end, killed where they stood."
So let's just look at the final numbers, because they are staggering. Carthage, with an army of about 50,000, lost around 6,000 men. Rome, with 86,000 soldiers, saw 70,000 killed on that field and another 10,000 captured. It was a complete, total, and just unthinkable annihilation. To this day, the single bloodiest day in the history of Rome.
So how on earth does Rome come back from something like this? I mean, how does a civilization built on the idea of military glory even process its greatest, most public humiliation? Well, they don't just rebuild their army, they rewrite the history.
And for me, this is where the story gets really interesting. Rome couldn't change what happened on the battlefield, so they changed the story of what happened. They had to ask themselves, how do you create a hero out of a complete and utter disaster?
So, the legend that Rome created is pretty simple. Varro, the impulsive new guy, he's the scapegoat. He's the reckless fool who caused the defeat and then ran away like a coward. Meanwhile, Paulus, the wise, noble aristocrat, he died a valiant hero's death. But when you look at the actual reality, it doesn't add up. Varro wasn't disgraced at all. In fact, the Senate officially thanked him for not giving up on the Republic, and he kept getting military commands for years. But Paulus, well, his story is where the great lie really takes shape. And this is the legend straight from the historian Polybius. He says, if there ever was a man who did his duty to the fatherland both throughout his life and in his final moments, this was Aemilius Paulus. He basically paints Paulus as the perfect Roman patriot, a shining hero, in stark contrast to the supposed coward, Varro.
Yeah, but modern historians have poked some major holes in this heroic story. First off, there's a huge contradiction. Polybius tells us Paulus was commanding the cavalry wing that got completely wiped out at the very start of the battle. So how did he miraculously survive that merciless slaughter, totally unharmed, just to ride over to the center of the battle and die heroically later? It doesn't make sense. Second, the story is wildly inconsistent with other ancient accounts. And third, Polybius writes it like he's a novelist, claiming he knows exactly what Paulus was thinking in his final moments. But here is the real smoking gun. Polybius was a close friend and a political client of Scipio Aemilianus, who just so happened to be the grandson of Aemilius Paulus.
So what does all this mean? It means the story of Paulus's heroic last stand probably wasn't history. It was political PR. It was a legend carefully crafted to save the reputation of one of Rome's most powerful families. And by creating a scapegoat in Varro and a martyr in Paulus, they managed to salvage a little bit of Roman honor from the ashes of a total catastrophe.
Which leaves us with one last fascinating question to think about. Hannibal won arguably the most brilliant tactical victory in all of military history, but he ultimately lost the war. Paulus lost the battle in a historic disaster, but he became an immortal legend. So who really won at Cannae? Was it the general who won the battle, or was it the one whose family got to write the history books? I'd love to know what you think. Drop a comment below.